Hey everybody, welcome to week 7 somehow already. I want to dive right into the material and as always try to fit these lectures into a watchable format, a watchable length. So let's do it. So today's objectives, just to briefly outline where we're going to head today, is to talk about some reviews on the assignments you've turned in the past, some basic reminders for class, like don't use single quotes. The one exception for that is if you're quoting somebody that has a quote in their quote, the inside quote only gets one upside down quotation, but just some basic grammar stuff to help y'all with your writing style. We'll talk about the lens method and what we mean by know thyself, an old Socrates saying. We'll talk a little bit about culture shock, cultural intensity factors, and then we'll take a look at what is going to happen with these next two parts of the project. So I want to start though with just a basic, simple question to keep us thinking outside the box, to keep us critically analyzing our own taken for granted assumptions. How many senses do you have? Of course, the answer most of you came up with was 5. And if you're thinking I'm trying to pull your leg, you might have said 6. Maybe there's a sixth sense. But think about how we all know there are far more senses than that. We just usually take for granted that there's only these 5. But when somebody says something like, do you have a sense of hunger? Do you know when you're hungry? You almost certainly know what that feeling is, and you can immediately realize it's very different than other feelings, and it's actually very different than thirst, which is a related but different. You might also say sexuality, or this feeling of being into somebody or being aroused, is also a sense we have, a connection to the outside world. A dizziness, if you spin around in a circle and then try to stand up, you're going to feel that things are out of kilter. Thirst we talked about. Direction, you actually tend to have a general sense of direction that if you close your eyes right now and tried to turn around 180 degrees, you could pretty closely approximate that, or you could turn 90 degrees. You could know where things are at. Humor, we know when something's funny. We know when it's time to make a joke. And there's lots of other ones you can think about right now. I've got a coffee cup in front of me. If I set it down and I close my eyes, I can still pick it up. So I have a sense of object permanence. I also have a sense of balance. If I start to tip, even if my eyes are closed, I can feel it. I have a sense of self-presence. I can close my eyes, and with my eyes closed, I can grab my ear. I didn't look at it, so I'm using some other sense to know where things are in space. So I want to put this out here just as a general warm-up to get us thinking about how sometimes things that we feel like we've got a good grasp on, a second look at those things can give us a deeper comprehension. All right, rule number 1 of cosmopolitanism, know thyself. This is Socrates. This goes all the way back to Plato. And it's an idea that by now I'm sure you're getting a hold of. This class is about getting to know not the culture you're traveling to, but yourself, so that you will understand how you're going to interact, what things are going to bug you, what situations you'll feel the most comfortable in. Frameworks. We've talked about quite a few of them now. We're more than halfway through the semester, and we've realized that these things like gender orientation, power distance, communication styles, they're going to be different no matter what culture you go to. But understanding that they will exist in some form in every culture gives us a generalization, sort of an anchor we can turn to make sense of confusing situations, as long as we remember it's not universal. The United States has a big name for being super pro-gun. And if you're traveling here, you might immediately assume, based on those histories, what you might read on the internet, everyone's got a gun. And you would be incredibly surprised to find out 50-50. A lot of people don't, depending on where you're going to be. And as we'll start to talk about today and on into next week in week 9, expect to feel this process of culture shocks. Now, part of you are in the online version of this class, so don't worry about the attendance part there, although I will say those that engage with the videos, those that have the most time logged in this Canvas module and it shows you've been on the modules, you did seem to do a lot better. Citations, many of you got from me, or you're going to get from me, highlighted areas that say you've got to cite this, you've got to define it, and you got to tell me, for God's sake, where did you get this definition? So when you talk about power distance or communication styles or orientations towards time or any of these, collectivism, individualism, you've got to define them how our authors define them to prove you've done the readings, and then cite those authors, use their words. One more reminder too, we talked about this in the last few lectures, but dominant identities tend to not really feel the power at work around them because they feel like the world is just in a way that they're used to. They don't encounter a lot of barriers to their success. So to go back to our old tried and true example of a group of people move to an area, they build homes, they build electricity and water and infrastructure, and they build restaurants. And if they're all vegetarians, they're not going to build restaurants that serve meat. No problem. They're dominant identities. They built structures and institutions to serve their needs. Now, somebody who eats meat comes into town, they're a subordinate and they're automatically going to feel out of place. They're going to feel like they're encountering barriers to their very survival, to their ability to eat. And of course, the dominant people might feel like they're being accused of being awful people, when in reality, that's not what it means most of the time. It's really easy as a dominant person to be totally immune to noticing your own dominant identity. And of course, now we've all got a good firm on social identity. You've submitted your papers. Gender, Americanness, political ideology, religion. These are the big C cultural things to some extent. So many of you realize there's a difference between saying, I'm a Christian or I'm a Republican, than there is in really diving in deep to those things, to the small C culture. How is your Christianity different than maybe every other example of Christianity you've encountered in your life, or maybe than people that live in other states or other parts of the country? And remember one more time, just as the final stamp on this social identity piece, because you're going to take those ideas and move them forward into your future projects, social identity is underneath cultural identity. It's what you do with the big C cultural identity you have when your friends, your family, your local community, when they take parts of it away and say, this part's no good, we don't consume this product, but we do consume that one. All right, so now that these quizzes are submitted, just a reminder that anything in this class, I say frequently, you can get whatever grade you want. That doesn't mean you get to choose your grade. It means if you're serious about getting a grade and you get a paper back from me or an assignment you're not happy with, look over the comments, ask me about fixing it, and within a reasonable amount of time, you can resubmit it to me. I'll regrade it. All right, our ever expanding review, you're welcome for this. I'm not gonna prolong it, but every week I've thrown something like this up on the board. This is a gold mine for these projects and even for your weekly assignments. When you're thinking, where did we talk about the cycle of socialization? It's been 6 weeks. You're welcome. All right, so let's dive into some stuff that wasn't deeply explained in the reading. Dialectics, or taking a dialectical approach to situations that you're going to encounter in the world. To keep this simple as we really get into a bigger and more complicated conversation over the next 10 minutes or more discussion, think of dialectics as you being this identity that's in the middle of all these social pressures. You've got culture pulling you in one direction. You've got people around you pulling you in another direction. Maybe there's some extreme situation going on and your assignment for the whole semester is due in 2 days and you feel like that's pulling you in another direction. And you can think about who you are in any minute is very determined by a lot of things that are in addition to who you actually are. It has a lot more to do with who you are today, who you are right now, who you are before you ate the snack versus after you ate the snack. One of the most interesting pieces of research about parole numbers is that the worst time to get paroled is before a judge has lunch, and the best time to get paroled is right after a judge has lunch. And the difference between simply where those parole hearings are placed is noticeably different. There's a huge statistical difference, but if you ask the judges, they don't notice. They think that that has nothing to do with their hunger. It must be something else. The lens method I've talked about a few times in this class. It's just a way to remember you're looking through a lens, right? In any situation when you say, what is going on? L, look at it. E, examine it. Like use the tools from this class that you've developed to say, what am I seeing here? What might this be? Note some possible explanations for what you're seeing. And then S, substantiate it. After you've chewed on it and you've thought about it, go to a friend, go to somebody in the community who you can trust and say, I experienced this thing and I'm not really sure what it is. I think I might understand, but can you verify that I'm reading this situation right? So we use this lens method as sort of one more know thyself stamp on the class. So let's go a little deeper into dialectics. This is a term that goes back to Plato. It probably goes back even earlier than that. And it is indeed this idea that whatever our understanding of a theory or a word or a thing or ourselves, whatever we think of as the sum total of that thing, it's not static, it's not stable. Who you were 5 years ago is nothing like who you are today. There are a lot of things that are still the same, but you've evolved, you've changed, and all of that has to do with experiences, things you've encountered in the world that sort of forced you to question some previously taken for granted norms. And through Bobby Harrow's cycle of socialization, we all sort of evolve. We change our minds a little bit. And it's worth thinking about this in an extreme case where you're, as you see in front of you here, I've got Breaking Bad characters. Are these good guys or bad guys? And television producers are great at toying with dialectical tension, of getting the viewers to sort of look at these characters and in one episode hate them. And then they see them do something that's almost redeeming, that's heartfelt. Or maybe they realize, oh, that thing they did that I hate them for, they actually did it to help someone else or to save someone's life. And we get this dialectical tension playing out that is very similar to what many of you will experience while you're traveling abroad. A situation, an event, a phrase somebody says to you that makes you feel like, what is going on? This is awful. How could they behave that way? And as time plays out and you experience other things, you may be forced to say, oh, I think I see that in a different light now. So again, this is about trying to prepare ourselves to be open when these situations of anxiety arise. Another good way to think of dialectics is like the yin and the yang. We tend to think as humans in black and white, yes or no. Very binary terms. Something is or it is not. It's a very simple way to do things. It's a good person or it's a bad person. I like that food or I don't. I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat. We need to, when traveling abroad, to try to break this thinking pattern so we can be a little bit more fluid in those moments of apprehension. So now let's dive into how they use their description of dialectics in the text. They break them into these 6 different categories that are much like what I was saying. You can see how some terms, some ideas are largely defined by their opposites or by their counterparts. And since they don't stay static, you can think of them more sort of moving around. Last week, I believe in the lecture, I mentioned Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. Now, generally, Republicans are against big government. They don't want the government expanding and having all sorts of new rules. And at least in our historical apex, they tend to be a little slower on the social justice, equality, anti-racism platform. That tends to be more of a liberal campaign. And here we got Abraham Lincoln, who is a Republican in the 1800s, who is pro-big government. He wants to literally invade the South and tell them what to do. And he is anti-racism. He's literally trying to make one of the first big moves. We could argue about whether or not he was still racist, but he's making some social justice moves that have long ripples through history. We could roll the clock forward and think of George Wallace in the United States in the 1960s. This is a guy who wanted to keep segregation in the schools, and that was what his campaign platform was. Segregation today, tomorrow, and forever. And he got these huge applause across the country from all the white folks. He was a Democrat. So dialectics are visible sometimes in real situations where you can see ideas, even like Democrat and Republican, can sometimes totally shift and look very different at one point than they do at another based on new experiences. So let's talk about a couple of these, because what they're trying to get at here is you can't always know somebody or know what somebody's trying to accomplish or communicate with a single interaction. Cultural or individual, what is the context that's informing this particular event? And you can think about how I might come from a culture where smoking marijuana is embraced. I'm from Colorado, right? But so in smoking, I might just be doing something that will show you, the viewer or the visitor or the cosmopolitan, oh, this is a cultural norm. I'm going to see a lot of this, and it says something about who they are. But it also might not be a cultural norm. And you can think of how when I travel to Michigan, well, Michigan's now legalized weed, but Atlanta, I have a daughter in Atlanta. And when I travel there and I'm smoking weed, I'm actually saying something or making a very different statement. I'm breaking the law. And anybody that looked at me and thought, oh, that's a cultural representation would have to read it through a different light. Because what they're actually seeing in that case is me making an individual decision, almost like my social identity. And again, this feels squishy. It feels sometimes when we talk about dialectics, like you can start to get a hold of it and then you kind of lose it a little bit. That's okay. That's really how this works, because it is an ongoing process of figuring out, of changing, of updating our beliefs just a little bit as we get a little closer to the capital T truth. So let's take a few more looks. Think about personal or contextual. Of course, in this situation, in this class, y'all only know me contextually because we haven't been hanging out on the streets. And you probably have gotten a lot of vibes from me, particularly as a teacher, that would say, compared to most, maybe I'm a little easier going, maybe I curse a little more, right? And because of that, you can assume that you're also seeing something of my personal identity. And it probably wouldn't surprise any of you if you saw me out in the streets and I talked to you in a casual way, or even if I cussed a little bit, because you've experienced it. But now take another teacher who you've had, who you would think of as like the epitome of the stuffy teacher who's always on their best behavior and they're dressed all perfect for class and they only talk proper to their students. And imagine seeing them in public and noticing that they're behaving very differently. You can get an example of when you're trying to get to know somebody and you're reading their behavior, it can be very hard to distinguish between whether they're acting the way they're acting because that's who they are, it's an expression of their identity, or is it cultural or institutional pressures? Are they working a job that requires them to say, hey, how you doing today? Can I help you? Another good example would be exactly that statement. In the United States, you're going to hear that 50 times in a day if you're moving through a big capitalist enterprise. Lots of people will be saying that to introduce themselves. And you have to know in those moments that's a contextual thing. That is not a personal trait. Nobody walks around the United States on their day off saying, hey, nice to meet you. Can I help you with anything? So another good example, to really figure out what's going on, we have to, in real time, remember, even as we go, I think it's this I'm seeing, it still might be a slightly different answer. Dialectics. Differences and similarities. You can think here of how we've talked about some of this. Every human that has ever existed needs to sleep. And we've talked about how every human makes art, every society needs to eat, needs to breathe, the list of things that all humans have in common. And then we've talked about some cultural differences, differences and similarities. And we could take it down to the level of cultures and say, in this image, we're seeing that all humans need to sleep, in this case, probably when they're stuck at an airport. But culturally, you can think of how different people, and even in the same culture, might sleep in different ways when they're in public. If you're in, say, a collectivist culture, you might get small and make sure you're not taking up too much space and you're not going to tip over. Perhaps if you're in an individualist culture, you take up 2 chairs and you spread your stuff all over and you don't care if you're in the middle of the aisle. How you pose yourself, whether you're leaned back and opened or you're closed and sort of protecting yourself, uncertainty avoidance. You can think of how those things would play in. And one more time, you would have to know not only is this something that's being done by everyone here, but rather is this a group of people in this big culture who maybe act a little bit different or who have some different norms. Dialectics. Static versus dynamic. This is a picture of New Orleans. This is the biggest avenue or corral or boulevard. I think this is actually a boulevard, but one of the biggest streets. Maybe it's the biggest street, actually. I think it's Canal Street, the largest street in the world, and how wide it is. If you look on either side of it, this is where a lot of the flooding came through on the edge of Katrina. You'll see that a lot of these buildings are relatively new. And you might travel to New Orleans as just one example. And if you start on this street, you may well get an impression that this is a very dynamic city. This is a city that, like Las Vegas, when something's old, blow it up, get rid of it, build a new one, and keep the new stuff in sight of the people that live here, which would maybe suggest they don't value tradition as much as they otherwise would. And then you could turn right off of this main street at Canal Street and go down to the French Quarter just a few blocks away, and you'll find a very static representation, a very preserved, old school, 200-year-old buildings that are still being taken care of despite bricks falling apart and things like that. And that's sort of the feel of the place. Now, which of these two is New Orleans? That's kind of the point. To really know, you have to stay there and experience it and soak it up and change your mind and think about it some more and go to another part of town. Dialectics. It's real time, challenging, updating, re-questioning what you know. Past and present. I think this is a great example in US context. This might not work so well in other country context because they might not know what this flag is, or that if you're particularly like in England, they wouldn't look at this flag the same way. It was called the Union Jack, if I remember right. Think about what this flag meant in 1982 when I was a kid. And really think about it. I know most of us are younger than to be able to actually remember that era. I mean, I was a baby at the time, but There was a show called The Dukes of Hazzard that came on when I was young. By the time I was 5 or 6, we would watch reruns of it. And it was these good old boys never meaning no harm. That's a quote from the introduction. Jessica Simpson remade it a decade and a half ago, if it's ringing a bell, or if you want to look up some clips. And these fellas drove around a orange Dodge Charger with a Confederate flag on the roof and on the doors, if I remember right. And they lived down in the South, and they ran from the law, and they helped people out when the law was trying to get them or when there were bad guys after them. And it was just sort of an action adventure show. There was never any talk of racism in it once. And as a kid, that's what I learned about this flag. That doesn't mean a lot of people didn't already know the history, but it means cultures shape beliefs, cultures shape understanding and knowledge of the people in that culture. And so I had no idea until later that this flag has a very different meaning. So let's go back to go forward and ask the next question. What did this flag mean in 1856? There's a man named William Thompson, who was one of the people who designed the original Confederate flag. It was the exact same flag, except it was on a big white flag, and then the Confederate flag was just the upper logo, but it was the exact same flag. They later updated it because they realized white flags are bad to fly in battle for a number of reasons. Number one, they look like you're surrendering, and number two, they get covered in blood and muck and gore the first time the guy falls down, and you don't know you can't read the flag anymore. You don't know which one's yours. Anyway, he designed this image, and he had this habit of going on the road. You can look this up if you want, and giving these speeches where he would say, this flag, this emblem should stand for all eternity as the symbol of superiority of the white man over the inferior races of people. That was what this flag was designed to mean. So in 1856, that is damn well what this flag meant. And everybody knew it because that's what was professed. And one more challenge here, if you're feeling like I'm not so sure, bring up the causes of secession. Every one of the southern states that declared war on the northern United States released a cause of secessions. It's basically we're out of here and we're going to go to war with you, a letter that you send to a country to declare war. And in it, you describe the reasons for war. And in every single one of them, the reason right at the top, often reiterated over and over, is the superiority of white folks over the other races was being challenged. The idea of black folks as property was being challenged. And the South wasn't going to have it because they were actually trying to expand the institution of slavery at the time. So in 1856, this image means something different. And then, of course, today, we've sort of gone through this cultural reawakening in the last few years, and we've realized, oh, this image does indeed mean something that actually nowadays is different than both. There's a whole new history attached to it with Dylan Roof, with some of the other protests and riots that went on in the early 2020s. So again, the flag never changed. Dialectically, our understanding of it and our cultural process of shaping our understanding of it changed. Privilege, disadvantage. We've gone all the way back to weeks 1 and 2. Intersectionality, this idea that as a convicted criminal, when I go into a prison to teach, that identity of criminal gives me privileges. The students look at me and they're like, oh, he gets it. They trust me a little easier. I leave the prison class and I go to drive home and I get pulled over. The exact same identity can be a subordinate identity. It puts me in a bad place when a cop's running my record. So who would I cite? We would go back to week 2, Beverly Tatum, and you could talk about how dominant and subordinate identities intersect. And then a few updates from the reading. They cut some of this out, but this is an older reading where they haven't yet updated that sexual orientation used to be a fireable offense. Right now, it's not. And then, of course, we don't ever lose who we are. So you can think of dialectics in your own world, not just as individual situations, but as the sum total of your histories, what makes you you. And so for me, my time in prison 20 years ago always informs situations I go through today, the lessons I learned there, the techniques for communicating with people, things like that. So the image you see in the reading is something like this, where you can think of dialectics as sort of looking at something like a reflection and trying to figure out what it is you're looking at and why it's shaped a little bit differently than what real life seems like. And this gives you space to always update your understanding. All right, last thing we got to get through today, and I know it's been a lot. If you want to take a break and pause it here and go get an orange soda or something, power to you. The stages of development. And let's just walk through them briefly, because this is something you need to use for your discussion post this week. Almost all of us know somebody who's been there or have been there ourselves, where we feel like maybe at the beginning of this class even, it's not going to be that different. I mean, I get it. I'm going to travel somewhere. Tell me where the bathroom is and how to get to the nearest food station, and I'm fine. I'll make do, right? It's not going to be that bad. This plays out in the United States often with the phrase, I don't see skin color, which is to say, like, I don't really notice any difference between cultures. This is almost always something that is easily uttered by people with many dominant identities. So if you're a white man in the United States who doesn't encounter a lot of cultural barriers to getting about your community or your world, you probably felt something like this at times. Now, as you start to take a class like this or you experience cultural difference, you get to a point where you start to notice that indeed there are some very real differences between cultures. And indeed, if you don't pay attention, you're going to be in trouble when you get there. But I think ours is still the best. And this is, of course, a framework anybody would take, not just someone from the US. I know the cultural frameworks here. And so my brain knows that I have a program set that's full, that it works. It works well enough. When people start saying, well, learn what it could be otherwise, I'll look at it, I'll start to get a hold of it, but I don't have the whole understanding, and it doesn't feel as complete and workable as a unit as mine does. I feel like I use mine all the time, right? It's just how I understand the world. This is what usually happens next. We'll talk about reversal at the end, because as we notice, the cycle continues to be a cycle. Once you get done traveling abroad, you're literally going to come back to the United States and have the same culture shock play out, and you'll have to adapt to here. So this is the stage. This is a image actually from the Gore election in the 1990s. But he's using this big magnifying glass to look really close, and that's the defense stage. Then we get to minimization, where we're like, okay, fine. There are cultural differences, and fine, maybe my culture's not the best and theirs is the worst, but we're just equal. But whatever differences they are, I still feel like there's a lot more in common with those people than we have differences. And as much as that's true, it's not going to help you when you're traveling abroad and you encounter that thing that you're like, this is too different, I don't like it. So we want to keep thinking about, what can I do to keep embracing, keep learning, keep getting better at knowing what to expect in this culture. And then we'll reach a point where we're like, okay, fine, I accept it. Things are different. I don't really know enough yet to make sense of it. And you can think of the Dunning-Kruger effect from week one. We're coming over the hill now and realizing I've got a lot to learn. I'm going to dive in and start trying to figure some stuff out. Then we get adaptation. You start to actually figure stuff out and get so good at it that you don't even have to think about it. You start layering up different things that are new tools in the culture you're in. And eventually you find yourself having walked to a restaurant without ever even having told yourself, what streets am I going on again? You just remember. Or you get in the car and you drive on the correct side of the road without having to remind yourself 4 or 5 times. And then eventually it just becomes what life is. And here's the problem: when you get ready to come home, you're going to have this process of reversal, of feeling like, oh God, I'm back now in this culture. And I actually think the culture that I just learned about, that I've been living in for years, is the best. I got to go home and tell everybody, oh, I can't believe you guys don't use chopsticks when you eat Chinese food here. You're missing out on so much. Oh, we're so individualistic in the United States. God, Dad, it was beautiful to live in this collectivist culture for a year. They took care of us there. That's the sort of normalcy that will come about. There's sort of a bonus here that we can think of. Nietzsche, the philosopher from the 1800s, talked about self-hatred, not in the traditional sense of, oh, I'm depressed, I'm just such a bad person, but in the sense of, when you want to do something or be somebody and you struggle to be the person you want to be nicer to people when your blood sugar is low, but then next week you miss lunch and you yell at somebody or you flip somebody off on the road, and then you feel bad about it later. That sort of self-hatred, the feeling bad about it and knowing you're the one that did it. And Nietzsche would say this sort of hatred is actually good, because as we just described, it's the only way humans incentivize ourselves to change. We have this feeling where something we've done strikes us as incompatible with who we want to be. And instead of being sociopathic or psychopathic and just being like, I don't care, it really bugs us. It bugs us so much we hate that thing that we did, and we deliberately try to work it out. And you can think about this in reference to this process of cultural updates that you're going to experience yourself traveling abroad. That you at times will feel like, oh, I know that thing's right there and I just can't get it right. I keep saying their name wrong, or I keep forgetting to bow when I walk in, or I keep forgetting to order my food right and they keep giving me dirty looks. Whatever the thing is, that's process of self-hatred, knowing that it exists and thinking about it as a fuel to compel you to change can be a helpful tool in real time to keep you from getting annoyed. All right. Humans do not perceive events directly, rather our experience of events is built up through templates, sets of categories that we use to organize our perception of phenomena. I should have included a page number in case anybody else wants to use this quote, but this is from this week's reading. And again, we're talking about how you are the product of experiences. And of course, you change your mind slowly all the time. Even after something as simple as a class like this, you're going to have small changes in who you are, what you believe, what you think about certain things. And I put these pictures of me from 20, 25 years ago up here when I was in prison and had just gotten out, to just as a reminder of who you are doesn't ever go away. You build onto it. You don't obliterate what you were in the United States when you travel abroad and build a new cultural identity. You're going to advance those identities. The old is always still there and it always still informs who you are. All right. And that's it. Since there is no discussion in the online lecture, make sure that all of these things that are on the board in front of you, if you have questions about them or you're struggling, that you're communicating with me. I'm your guy, boots on the ground wise. And just another reminder, this really is a class, even on week 7, that you can get just about any grade you want. But to do that, you have to make sure you're getting me the stuff that is required to be turned in. If it's late or you don't like a grade you got, email me. We can work on it, but don't let this quarter tick away and end up on week 10 trying to last minute stack a bunch of stuff in. Let's get it done before then. See y'all next week.